Welcome back to the 1600 game. I'm Jeremy Champa. Today we're going to walk through a handful of questions in mathematics, and then we're going to turn our attention to the grammar part of the test in preparation for this coming week in our group program, the Mastery program, in which we're going to be taking a look at the punctuation material in a really deep and hopefully potent way for you as you're studying for this test. But I want to start by attacking a couple of questions that point out the limitations of a Desmos approach to the test. Last time I was here, I was telling you folks about the amount of people, the sort of proliferation of a hack the test with Desmos kind of meme going around the world of test prep. So look, the fact is that this tool is extremely powerful, and don't get it twisted. It's going to be an extremely useful thing for you as a test taker, and you should get really good with the calculator. But if you're the kind of student who's looking for the easy way to beat this test, you need to know the limitations of these sort of hacks. So I love a good hack. I'm going to show you all kinds of hacks in all different parts of this test. But I just want to show you what happens if you use a tool but you don't have the full sort of comprehensive skill set required to make the most of the tool. So there's, what I would recommend is that you use these tools, but that you also understand that they're not a panacea or a cure-all for you as a test taker. So the first question we're going to look at is on our screen here. And shout out to the College Panda, who is a guy named Nelson Fu. I think he lives in the Boston area, and he makes great textbooks. So if you're working through our program and you've exhausted all your other resources, I would highly suggest using the College Panda to supplement those resources, particularly in mathematics. He does a great job. So I'm taking from his book here. This is the digital College Panda. So this book has a number of great questions that mirror the test makers. And Nelson is a man after my own heart, in as much as when he writes questions, he tries to see into the future of the test a little bit. That is to say, he looks at the current difficulty level, the current complexity of the test, and his hardest questions try to predict where the test will be next year, which is what top scorers need in terms of preparation. So well done, Nelson, if you hear this. Good job on this question. So here's a question number 18. See on my screen here. I'll read the whole thing, but I'm going to, as we read this, take it on in the way that I would recommend that you do. And I'm also going to show you what happens when you use Desmos in a way that is less than perfect, but probably the way that most of us are going to use the tool. So we start with the last sentence first, and the last sentence says, based on the model, what was the height in feet of the ball 5 seconds after it was struck? And basically what my recommendation to you is, as a test taker, is when you read something like that, do something to mark what you really care about, which is that last phrase, where was the ball 5 seconds after it was struck? And as you start reading this passage, you're going to notice we get some points. So I'll read this from the top. It says, a golf ball was struck from a certain height. This is going to end up mattering a lot. A certain height above the ground. And we don't know where that certain height is. The ball reached its maximum height at 72 feet above the ground 3 seconds after it was struck. So I'm going to show you two ways of doing this here. Whichever way you do it, you have to hit the pause button as soon as you have information that you can utilize. So the sort of approach that I would recommend is immediately that should trigger an understanding of vertex form. And it doesn't take much for you to know vertex form for a parabola. Simply put, it's y equals some a value. You can think of that as like a scale factor that's going to make the parabola open in a more steep or more gradual way. And it's going to open up or down depending on its sign. Times, in parentheses, x minus the value at the vertex, which is usually called h. That's the x value at the vertex. The whole thing squared plus k. Okay, So with that equation, you would write a, and then you would have x, I guess, minus 3, since we know that 3 seconds is the moment of max value, and the height, which is the maximum, is 72. Okay, so you have an equation that's pretty much filled out. The only thing we don't have is a, right? So if you were taking the Desmos approach, what you would do is you would type table. Let me do that. So you would type table, and you'll get this beautiful little table here, and you can put in some values, 3,72. And the next thing we learn is that the ball hit the ground 7 seconds after it was struck. So if you're taking the Desmos first approach, you're putting a 7 in for x and a 0 in for y. And if you're taking my approach that I would recommend, once you see what happens here, you would just put those values in for y and x. So that would be pretty simple, right? You would just say y equals 0 and x equals 7. So you have 7 minus 3. Oops, I wrote the answer to 7 minus 3. 7 minus 3 squared plus our 72. Okay, so the Desmos thing is amazing, but you have to know the limitations. So when you click regression here, and then you hit quadratic regression, I want you to see what you get. I want you to notice what you get here. If you look at this graph, it goes through 0, 0. It's a beautiful parabola, goes through our vertex, right? But if you're not paying attention to what's going on here, you get the wrong graph, which is the one that goes through 0, 0, right? And of course, that's inaccurate. Why do we know it's inaccurate? Well, because we were told, I suppose you don't know for certain it's inaccurate when it says a golf ball was struck from a certain height above the ground and its max height is 72 feet at 3 seconds. So a certain height above the ground, you could be like, well, maybe that certain height is 0, right? And if it were, then this would be a perfectly accurate equation. But it goes through 0, 0, and that's a problem. So look, I'm sure that the Desmos bros will come at me here for saying, well, there's a way to fix that. That's probably true. The point I'm trying to make is that as a student studying this test, once the tool becomes so complex that it requires more advanced training to use the tool, then the tool starts to become less valuable than the effort you're putting into mastering the tool, right? So if the tool creates a new problem for you, you have to evaluate whether that new problem is actually worth solving or the tool should only be used in simpler situations, right? So if you got this one, the way I'm suggesting that you do it, which is just by solving for a in the simple equation, it's not so bad. We'll do the calculation right here. 7 minus 3 is 4. 4 squared is 16. So this equation becomes 0 equals 16a plus 72. You could then solve for a by subtracting. Maybe you just subtract 72 and divide by 16. That would give you a is negative 4.5 or negative 9 over 2. That's a. And then all you have to do to finish this question is to put that value back in. So you have your y value, which is what we care about when x is 5. So your equation is now y equals negative 9 over 2 or negative 4.5 times the value of x is 5 minus 2 squared plus 72. Okay. And this equation will give you precisely what you need, right? So my point is that this parabola that we've been given is a different parabola than the one that we needed it to be because it was hit from a certain height above the ground, right? So, and if we look at the value for 5 here, there it is. It's, roughly, where is it? Right there. Yeah, it's roughly 58. So it's pretty close to what we want anyways, but the point is that this parabola looks a little bit different than what we expected because our tool that we're using requires some complexity. I want to show you an even cleaner case in which people get totally duped. There's nothing wrong with the calculator. I'm not saying that the calculator doesn't work. I'm saying that your use of the calculator could lead you to a trap. Okay, so let's talk about our other approach or our other question that I wanted to bring up to you with sort of the limits of Desmos here. And that's a question that I saw with a student just the other day. Let me pull it up. Circles. Here we go. Okay. It's a classic question. It shows up, I think, on practice test 4. So if you see practice test, if you've taken practice test 4, maybe you recognize this question. It says the graph of x squared plus x plus y squared plus y equals 199 over 2. And then they ask us what's the length of the radius. Okay. So if you put this into Desmos, which I totally understand why you would, because this is an equation that a lot of folks forget. Geometry was a long time ago. It's not that the calculator misgraphs this. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that if you look at this graph and you haven't been trained, you would think that you've got like a graph at 0, 0. It pretty much looks like the center's at 0, 0. But the center is actually at 1 or -1 comma negative, or -1/2. I'll show you why I know that. But basically, looking at this graph, what happens is people assume that the values at the x-intercepts, which here's one of them, -10.48749, comma 0. And then over here, there's another one as well. It looks like these are, that the radius would be half of the distance from one of those to the other. And it's really close, but it's not quite right. So I'll show you why that's the case. When you do this, when you know what's up with this question, you're looking for the version that gives you the radius is x minus h squared, y minus k squared equals r squared. And you basically have to complete the square. The first time you do this, it requires a little bit of thinking and a little bit of practice, but basically you take half of this coefficient of 1 and you put it in parentheses, x plus 1/2. Same thing for the y value, half of the coefficient of y, so that's y plus 1/2 squared, and this equals the radius squared. But we don't know what that equals yet. What we know is that when we expand this out, we get the values we want, the x squared plus x. We also get a quarter here, 1/2 squared. Same thing over here, we get y squared, we get positive y, and we also get a quarter. So the thing that equals r squared is not just 199 over 2, but 199 over 2 plus 1/4 plus another quarter, which is equal to 200 over 2 or 100. So your radius is 10. But the number of people who think that the radius is like 10.4 or 9.4 based on whichever of the two x coordinates or x intercepts people went to, it's huge. Again, I'm not telling you the calculator fails here. I'm telling you that the normal student who uses the calculator for a couple of hours is going to stumble on this question, not because of the failure of the tool, but because, what a tech person would call a user error. That is, if you don't have perfect use of the calculator, if you haven't mastered the calculator, then the calculator becomes just another way for the test makers to create traps for you, right? So my approach is, yes, use the calculator for the heavy lifting of like fancy calculations. But every time you're offloading, there's a great phrase from the media critic Marshall McLuhan. He says, every augmentation is also an amputation. And what that means is every time you supplement or add to something, you augment something. That is, maybe you augment your skill set by saying, I'm going to use this calculator. I've got this fantastic tool that, essentially takes care of a huge part of my work for me. That's an augmentation. But also, there's an amputation involved in that, which is we tend to get a little bit lazy and offload onto the calculator things that need not be offloaded onto the calculator. So if you know how to complete the square, if you're someone going for a 750 on the test or a 780 on the test, then you shouldn't use this calculator for this question. You should be able to look at this really quickly and say, okay, I have to complete the square, and you do that process. It's pretty quick and easy, okay? So again, use the calculator, use it wisely. That's all I'm saying, right? So if someone tells you, I got an 800 on the SAT and it's totally because of Desmos, they're lying to you. It's just not true. They got an 800 on the SAT because they worked really, really hard, whether in mathematics or in the use of Desmos, or most likely both. But then they also had to become a great reader. They had to do so many things to get, an 800 in either of these two sections, or a 1600 overall. So use the calculator, but don't fall into into the delusion that these clickbaiters want to get you to think, you can just ace the test just by smashing buttons on your calculator. The test makers know exactly what they've given you. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. There's a couple of questions that kind of prove my point, and students can keep sending me this stuff. Any questions that Desmos has helped you get got on, then you should send them to me and I'll blast them out into the world to help people understand the dangers of the calculator. And by the way, if you've got a cool trick that you can show me that kind of proves how to use the calculator on either of these questions, then great. I mean, all my students should be aware of everything that they have going for them, but use these tools with caution. Okay, let's move to a slightly different thing. There's something kind of exciting going on this week, which is the mastery program is finally getting started. So we had a bunch of students who needed to finish out their semesters or their quarters before we could get started, but we're starting up this week. So if you haven't figured out what you're doing for test prep yet, this is the best thing you can do. It's very affordable. It's very easy to get started. And basically using our app plus the live stream where you get together with us, I'm going to be there twice a week. The tutors are going to be there 3 days a week. That's 5 days a week that you've got live support while you're working through some material. There's strength in numbers, so come join us. This week we're going to be talking about punctuation. And the idea is, can we see punctuation with the view of a master? Right? Can you see this stuff the way that somebody with real experience sees this stuff? That's the goal, is to impart that kind of vision to you on the test. So we have all sorts of materials in the app. I'll show it to you real quick that you can kind of get yourself up to speed on the basics. Most people who are studying for the punctuation and grammar test, more broadly, the grammar part of the test, they're coming to us with, some confusion from the fact that they haven't thought about grammar in a long time. Okay, so in the lessons section of our app, we've got a whole section called the grammarian. And here I go through a lot of the rules. There's also a little ebook that's going to teach you all the boundaries rules, all the punctuation rules, as well as all the rules for form, structure, and sense. So everything you need to bring yourself up to speed is in the app. The purpose of the mastery program is to supplement your study with a vision of what it looks like when you've got this stuff totally unlocked. And that vision is not, something like noticing everything and processing everything at the highest level. It's knowing where to put your attention and pouring your attention into those spots with the exact right information to help you make good decisions. So I'll show you what that looks like on a couple questions. By the way, for students who are aiming at high scores, we're all very tempted to look at the hardest questions, right? So you go over, let me just show you kind of where I'm getting some of these questions here. The College Board's question bank is an amazing resource. It's way better than whatever you're doing on Khan Academy. Khan Academy's questions are a little sneaky. Basically, they're interested in helping you understand some skills, but not helping you understand any strategy. So they'll show you some math questions, but if they show you some questions about circles, you can bet the sneaky little trap that I just showed you with Desmos in that circle is nothing that they're going to even hint at on Khan Academy. So you might as well use the College Board's resources for one thing and one thing only, which is to look at the questions from actual SATs and get a sense of what those questions are like. So you can see the traps and practice with the real thing. The question bank is where you're going to do that. So on my screen, you can see SAT in this question bank. You can just type SAT question bank. It's on SAT Suite Educator, that part of the site. You pick your section, and then you can pick some specific ideas. So if you picked standard English conventions, if you're the kind of person who's aiming at a top score, you basically are going to say something, you're likely to say something like, let's make the difficulty level a certain way. So you can click difficulty and you'll probably pick hard. And that's great. You're going to get a bunch of good questions. You can filter by type, boundaries, for instance, and you'll get a bunch of hard questions. Now, that's great. Basically, I don't even know if there are more than, it looks like there's, less than 100 of these, right? There's 78 questions in this set, 78 boundary questions. So that's in the hard stuff. But 78 questions, that's pretty good. It's going to give you a sense of what's going on. But something interesting happens when you start looking at the medium level questions, which is you'll realize that some of the things that you thought were hard when you started studying, once you master them, they're not so hard because the test is so predictable. But some of the things in the medium level are actually different, not in just difficulty, but in kind. So they're different kinds of questions. And because of that, your training on the hard questions can leave some gaps that the medium level questions can help you fill. So if you're using the College Board's question bank, good. Make sure you're considering so-called medium level questions as well as hard. That'll fill in some gaps, particularly in these skill-based parts of the test, like the grammar section. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a couple of the ones that I think are the most interesting. I'm going to skip some ones that you could learn from, but that perhaps aren't the most important. The thing I want to talk about today is commas, because commas are something we're all comfortable using, but they're also very difficult to understand in terms of their uses, and that's because they're flexible, right? So semicolons have a couple very clear rules. We'll probably talk about those along the way. M dashes have clear rules. Colons have clear rules. Periods, of course, have clear rules. Commas have clear rules, but they also have more use cases. So because there's more use cases, those rules, even if each individual rule is clear, the sum total of the use of commas on the test is maybe more ambiguous, less clear, because there's so many different ways they could be used. So you have to keep in mind multiple things, whereas with a semicolon or with an M dash, you've got a simpler analysis, okay? So I'm going to show you some questions where we basically have to make a choice between a comma or nothing at all, or commas in different places, okay? So this is a very good question. This question asks us, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you because the idea that I'm trying to bring to your attention is that some things matter more than others. There's a lot we do not care about here. What we really care about is, let me use some color. Do we have a comma after carbon 13 or not? And do we have a comma after the parentheses or not? That's all we care about, right? We'll do all the reading that we do with that in mind. That means some things that we could read actually don't matter and we won't read. Okay, so when you're doing a question like this, you try to find where the sentence begins and ends. The end of the sentence is here at the word sugar. That means basically I don't care about anything after that period. And the other thing I care about is what are the other punctuation marks within this sentence. I'll use a slightly different color here, or how about a radically different color? Here's a comma after isotope. Okay. Anything that I do with my answer choices has to be in reference to what's happening in the sentence already, what's happening at this word isotope. Okay. So I will read maybe this sentence, but I'm also going to see if I can skip some stuff. So I have an eye for phrases that don't matter. We have a study led by this scientist at this university. That can just be a study. A study found that black bears, we could read the rest of this. I'll be a little bit generous. Black bears that eat human food before hibernation have increased levels of a rare carbon isotope blank due to higher 13 sea levels. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Pay attention. This is what I mean about a sort of a master's eye view. Pay attention to what happens after your punctuation in the sentence. here's this phrase I'm going to pay attention to. Due to higher levels. Okay? Due to higher levels. So I'm going to ask you a simple question. Who or what is due to higher levels? Who or what are we referring to? What is due to higher levels? Well, it's you can answer the question a few different ways, but it's some version of the increased levels of this isotope are due to the higher level, right? That seems pretty obvious. The thing that is due to higher levels in the corn is the higher levels in the bears, right? So these increased levels. Okay, so now we get to apply a very simple rule, right? So setting this up required some skill, right? Notice there was things we didn't care about. We didn't care about the sentence later. We didn't care about some of the details in the sentence that we were looking at. We cared about the punctuation and the stuff on either side of that punctuation. Okay. Now the simple question. The simple rule. The simple rule is if you have, a thing on one side, let's say something like a noun. Sometimes I'll be even less formal. I'll say a thing. Let's say a noun and then something like a verb, or a noun and a preposition. Either one of those. If you've got a comma involved, you can have 0 commas or 2 commas. You're never going to separate things that go together. In this case, the things that go together are increased levels due to something. You're going to have 0 commas or 2 commas. Now, we already have one in our sentence. We already have the one after isotope, which basically means that I need another one in my sentence. Right, so I have one here. I need another one. Okay. And let's figure out where it should go. If basically what that means is I can cross off C and I can cross off B because I need one more comma, right? 2 commas or none between a noun and a verb, or a noun and a preposition. So the question is, should it be after 13 or after the parentheses? Well, if you put it after the 13 in answer choice A, think about what you're reading around and what you are leaving in. The 2 commas here are working like parentheses. So to read around it, we would say, bears that eat human food before hibernation have increased levels of a rare carbon isotope, and then this thing in parentheses, due to higher levels. That's not really what we want to do. We want to separate the entire idea of carbon-13 from the information before and after, right? So the best answer is D, and the reason is if we don't put that comma after the parentheses, we're saying that the set of parentheses is next to due to instead of the set of parentheses being included in our description of carbon-13, right? So 2 commas instead of 0 because we didn't have an opportunity for 0. 2 commas instead of 1 because 1 comma will break up this phrase, increased levels due to, right? So simply put, commas break stuff up. You got to figure out what you want broken up and what you don't. And what I hope to do is to help clarify those rules for you. Let me show you another one that I think is kind of interesting. Yes, this one right here. Okay, so a brief note about a couple of the other rules so we can get to our discussion of commas. Remember that semicolons have a very clear and simple use case. There's really 2 use cases. The main one is a semicolon is in most cases equal to a period. Okay, well, what that means is, if there are both periods and semicolons as options, in most cases, you can't be asked to pick between those, right? And that's what we have in A and B, right? Before we can say that for sure, we have to check to make sure the other use case of semicolons is not operative, which is a complex list. The way you check is actually really simple. If you see a semicolon in your answer choice, you have a very simple next step. You ask yourself, are there other semicolons in my passage, in my sentence? So I look through this sentence starting at the very top, Beatrix Potter. I'm just looking for a semicolon. I don't see it. So what that means is we have the normal use of the semicolon, which is 2 full sentences. and that use is exactly equivalent to a period. Here's an important note. Test makers can't ask you to choose between two functionally equivalent answers. So two answers that are the same in terms of their function have to both be wrong, because it can't be the case that you don't get into your dream school because whatever, they like semicolons better, or they're feeling like a period is a better choice here. Those choices are stylistic. It's purely vibes. That cannot be the reason that you get a question wrong or right. So we can leverage that fact as test takers and cross off A and B. Those answers are functionally equivalent. They're both out. Now you have a much simpler question, or at least, if it's not purely simple, it's at least simpler, which is, do we want a comma between fungi and producing or not? And I'll read the sentence here, but I'll read only the part that I really care about, which is after the word but. If you'll recall this rule, comma fanboys, any of the single syllable conjunctions, if you want to sound smart, say monosyllabic conjunctions, for and nor, but or yet so. Those monosyllabic conjunctions, single syllable conjunctions, separate full sentences if they're coupled with a comma. So what that means is, for my analysis, which is, do I want a comma after fungi and before producing, all that I care about is the sentence after the word but, the independent clause after the word but. So I'm only going to read there, and I'll grab a different color and I'll underline. She also dedicated herself to mycology, the study of blank, more than 300 paintings of the fungal species she observed. Okay, I'll just stop there. It's a good idea to read all the way to the period. If you keep reading, you'll notice that all of this just kind of continues to describe what's happening. We don't have any other punctuation. As I said in the last question, you always want to consider what other punctuation is operative. So I have a comma after mycology. Okay. So this is a good example of how commas can be used in multiple ways. You could wonder if a comma after fungi is operating along with the comma after mycology to create a set of parentheses. Now, you could try that. That would be a reasonable thing to think about. Let's read around it, and it'll sound really strange. Hey, guess what? She also dedicated herself to mycology, more than 300 paintings of the fungal species she observed. Like, that sounds really weird. Or, I'm sorry, she also dedicated herself to mycology, producing more than 350 paintings. Maybe it sounds okay. So once I put that word producing back in there, maybe it sounds okay. Let's read it without the comma, and I'm going to read what happens basically from the comma after mycology. I'm going to start with the study. So if answer choice C is the right answer, what that's going to mean is that fungi and producing are working together. They're not getting broken up. Okay? The study of fungi producing more than 350 paintings. Okay? Now, that's a pretty interesting study. It sounds like in this study, the fungi are actually making paintings. It's kind of a mind-blowing thing worth perhaps studying if it were true. But it changes the meaning of the sentence, right? So basically, if we say answer choice C, after mycology, we have a full sentence, before mycology, she also dedicated herself to mycology. If you have a comma and then no other punctuation, everything that follows the comma is probably a description of mycology. And mycology is not the study of fungi producing paintings, right? And then without even knowing anything about the sentence, without knowing anything about mycology, you could say, do we really want to say that fungi producing paintings? Is that something we want to say? Maybe it is something we want to say in a creative way, or in a strange way, but it's not something we believe that this sentence is actually trying to communicate, right? So when I give this very simple explanation, it almost sounds glib. If I say, if you want to know if you should add a comma or not, just wonder if the words before and after should be broken apart. That sounds almost tautological, right? A comma breaks things up. We all know that, right? But what I'm trying to point out when I say that you should consider the word before and after is that basically, just because we pause in our speech doesn't mean that we should break up two words. Sometimes two words are working together, and if they are, they should not be broken apart. In this case, fungi producing paintings means something very different than saying that Beatrix Potter, the subject of this sentence, dedicated herself to mycology and made some paintings, right? So the difference between C and D is, simply put, whether we're saying fungi producing paintings or not. And we're not, even if it's fun to think that we might say that. So the right answer, therefore, has to be the one with the comma, okay? And one last note about this. If you watch content from me or any number of other, hopefully smart people who will talk to you about this test, the sort of inherited wisdom is you should add less punctuation and not more. That you should always avoid adding commas, okay? And that's true, that generally speaking, adding commas is dangerous on the SAT. But you can see, just sort of like we saw with Desmos, if you rely on something simple, you can take it to a certain level, but you're not going to experience sort of mastery of the material, right? So yes, if you are someone who's stuck at 550 in the reading section and you're looking at your score report and you've got like a bunch of points you're losing in standard English conventions, then by all means, you should absolutely, just lean on the basic rule, which is don't add a comma unless you feel like it's absolutely necessary. Like lean away from adding punctuation. But if you're someone who's aiming for a top score, that kind of broad generalization is not the kind of thing that's going to get you that top score that you want, right? So you have to actually study when these things are used and when they're not. And the good news is that, if you're someone who wants to go to a top school, you're probably someone who should be interested in the finer points of communication, and learning these skills can help you with that as well. But most importantly, for someone trying to nail this test, nailing these rules is an entirely achievable goal. And you just have to descend into the particulars a little bit more than I'm just going to throw something in Desmos or I'm just going to avoid adding punctuation. In either case, you're missing the sort of granular details that make the difference between a perfect score and something less than that. So if you want more of this kind of insight, then you should join us in the mastery program. I'll be there Sunday night, and we'll be back with more of the 1600 game. Thank you very much. Take care.